Hello, and welcome to this instance of the Azure Advent Calendar with myself, Ryan Yates, Cloud and Data Center Management MVP, and with me today I've got
Rick Hepworth, Azure MVP, and generally loud guy, so welcome to me trying to stay quiet for Ryan's session.
So today we're going to talk a little bit around Azure Governance, but not just around the ops side of things. We're going to talk a bit about the dev side as well, because that's an area that I think, from my experience, gets left behind. Don't know about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that you've already had some great sessions on how you can apply Azure Governance and things like blueprints as part of the Advent Calendar. What we really wanted to riff on today was the car crashes we've seen, the why they happen, and how you can avoid them. Really trying to underline that importance of governance, I think, right, Ryan?
Yeah, and I think one of the key things is, as I said, that we want to get around from this is that although the Azure platform can do a lot for you, there's a lot more than just what the Azure platform can give you that you need to consider. So we'll talk a bit more about all of those.
So, I mean, how many times have you been on site and you've sat with a project team and they go, well, so yeah, we know we need governance, but we're on a tight time frame and we've got a really crack squad of devs on this. So actually we're hoping that governance is one of the things they're going to deliver and we'll implement that at the end of the project. Because that's never gone wrong, right?
I can't say I've seen that go right once yet.
Nope. Or my other favourite, so the IT guys, they're really constrained on bandwidth. They wish they could be involved, but they can't. So we're going to do all of this and then we'll link up with them when we've finished. Yeah, because that one will be fine too, right? Yeah. Or
interesting.
My other personal favourite is the governance. No, we really don't care about governance. We actually don't know anything about governance or constraints or management, but part of the deliverables in the first few sprints of this project is going to be to build that. And we've got, again, our devs are highly experienced. They've built a load of solutions on-prem. They're all good .NET devs, and we know they'll be able to pick this up and figure it out.
Yeah, there's also the age-old, there's a software dev consultancy firm. They've done a lot of software development over the years, and that's actually all they've done. They've never really owned the operations of a product afterwards.
Yep.
So they've never had to think about, well, what's the end running of this product? They built it for other customers. So those types of devs are really, really good because, as you said, they know what they're doing from a dev's perspective, but they never really had to look after infrastructure.
No, it's very true.
You know, coming to the world of Azure, you get people who are both sides of what was that fence, as it were, where they're now actually trying to do both parts of that type of work and finding the struggles.
It's a different situation, isn't it? So when we're creating an app for on-prem, we own the environments. As developers, we can deploy new ones, we can throw them away, we can break them, we can fix them, and we stamp a new DVD or whatever it is we give to our customers every 6 months or 12 months, and we might have some kind of managed deployment service, so the customers might do it themselves, but we don't see how it runs, we don't see them managing it in production, and a lot of things change when we're trying to do things in the cloud, right?
So yeah, from my perspective, when I've seen organisations in the past that have got good governance, they've probably got good governance because they're actually very ops heavy, they're not very dev heavy. And it's probably because they actually have a lot to comply with. So they've got PCI compliance that they've got to do. They may even have government requirements like FedRAMP, these sort of things. And governance actually builds on top of what compliance you need as an organisation to comply with, what regulations you need to be worried about. And getting good governance in, most organisations put so much on that it stops the dev teams being able to go and deploy even into their own internal on-premises infrastructure.
Yeah.
That makes getting something over the fence, as it were, a 6-month task to getting a VM, deploying some code on it, doing a change control process. All of that actually can be brought back a little bit once you get both your teams talking together, and the cloud helps with the scaling out for that.
It is interesting actually how many times we see developers feel like they're trapped because it takes them 6 months to get a new environment on-prem. They think the cloud is the escape route to more freedom, but because they're in a regulated environment, the organization wants to treat the cloud as an extension of on-premises and puts exactly the same constraints in. And they, for the first few projects, the devs are railing against this. The IT guys aren't seeing the benefit. The business is sat there going, why are we paying for cloud? Because we thought we were getting speed and agility and flexibility, and we're seeing none of this. And actually, all it needs is a bit of a step back and the realization that with careful partitioning and the right people in charge of the right things and the right rules in the right places, you really can sort of have your cake and eat it on this one. That the developers need to realize that they have to be accepting of some rules and some soft fences so they don't hurt themselves, right? And the IT pros need to realize that actually in amongst this beautiful fortress that they build that complies with the men with clipboards and grey suits, they build a little playground where the rules are a bit more relaxed. And then the questions become, well, how do we move things from the playground into the fortress, knowing that it's been built to comply with the rules? And how do we ensure that the whole shebang doesn't cost us a fortune because we've totally missed the point of little things like, when we're in the office, you turn your machine off at night because you're going home, nobody's using it. But I always forget to turn stuff off in the cloud.
That's one way that you can look at it. I mean, taking the VMs in the cloud sort of approach, we can automate around that. Looking at, getting the IT pros on board to help the devs save money is one of the key parts of governance, because you want to make sure that you're not expunging money over nothing. There's no point having a virtual machine that a dev's going to be working on in the morning that's on all night costing money when they're definitely not using it. Unless, of course, they're like some of the devs I know who are on 24/7.
Yeah. So I have seen organisations deliberately implement stuff in the cloud and then have rolling teams of devs working globally. But you've got to be quite a large organisation to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got lots of pain points. We've got, oh my god, I accidentally blew the budget in the first 2 days of the project, or heck, I've built all of this thing and it turns out that it's all on still in preview services and the IT guys won't let me use it. Or it's beautiful and it works, but it only works in central US because they've not rolled any of my key services out elsewhere, and I've got to be GDPR compliant, I've got to put stuff in Europe, or thanks very much Brexit, I've got to put stuff in the South. So how can we translate that into areas of governance and then try to move from those areas of governance to how we're going to implement?
I think that one involves a lot of conversation within the organisation. No jumping into the cloud and just saying, here, have a free-for-all. Because what happens is you have things like a dev who's got it against their corporate credit card that's doing the production instance, and then you've got that dev leaves. And it wasn't actually their corporate card in the end that we find out. It was their personal credit card that they've run this against. And it wasn't even a corporate identity that they were against. And I know we've got some horror stories with similar approaches.
So genuinely, I've seen the whole of the Azure bill was on the IT director's credit card, and when he moved on, they cancelled the card, and 30 days later, all the Azure services stop. I've seen actually organisations be really diligent and careful about managing permissions, but invited everybody into their Azure AD as a guest account using Microsoft accounts, and well, that's my account, right? If I leave, you can't disable it, so then they've got a real struggle to work out who got access to what and when and why and where. I've also seen organisations be the victim of literal theft, where a developer has changed the billing address on the account, changed the security, locked out everybody but themselves in an attempt to steal the IP and the assets of the organisation they were working for. And you'd be surprised how often we encounter things like that as consultants, I think, wouldn't you?
Yes, I'd like to say it's not the norm, because it's not, but it's not uncommon either. It's not the rarity that you would expect it to be. One of the things, though, that you can make sure that we can do is having a good governance plan in place. Things like making sure you've got a policy that says when somebody leaves, you do disable their account. Make sure it's a corporate account, as opposed to, as you said, a Hotmail account or random other accounts coming in from other Azure Active Directories or Gmail accounts, anything like this.
So does that mean that before I start using Azure, I've got to have this big boys book of governance that I can club people to death
I
with?
don't think you need to have a big book to begin with. I think you have to have a good idea of what makes sense to begin with. And there's nothing stopping you actually turning around and saying, as long as you've got everything in a good way in the development world, from actually going, right, we've got this one tenant, we screwed it up, let's rebuild and start again fresh. There's nothing stopping you doing that. So you've got to have some idea of what good governance looks like in the cloud, but you don't have to have the full picture. And I think if you try and go down that route with trying to have the full picture, especially from the ops side, you're just going to get angry devs. And you're actually going to still get angry ops people, because they're going to get a phone call out at 2 o'clock in the morning saying this thing in Azure that they didn't even know about is down. And they've got to somehow work out how they get that back online.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of this is all about communication, and not having a dev and an ops guy fighting at the fences to get things out.
So I always like to think of sort of 3 pillars, and if you've got those right, you're probably going to be okay. The first one is, really seriously, don't put your subscription on a credit card, unless you are a 2-man startup, and even then there are better ways of doing it. You know, I don't care whether it's enterprise agreement or CSP or however you do exactly the new MCA, but please do this in an organised manner where you can invoice. So that's the right. We've got a sensible way of paying for the services we're going to use. The second pillar is identity. If I had a penny for every time I've seen the Azure AD that the devs are using, that all of the subscriptions for the whole organisation, and it's something like Ryan Yates at _ .onmicrosoft.com, because it's been built from a live account.
Yeah.
No, create a proper org account. If you've got Office 365, you're in a good place with that one, but create a proper org account, and then you've got one place to manage all of your identities, and therefore one thing to manage all your security.
One thing on that is, I've seen some organisations where they want a bit more security, is they go and create a separate Azure Active Directory that's not the same as what they use for Office 365, so that they've got a bit more tightness of who can access all those services. That works really well. What you do lose though is the nice easy agility between me as a user going into Office 365, into Azure, and all of the working around with all of those.
We can still do guest accounts though, right? So you can still have your corporate account in the main Azure AD that's then a guest on the Azure one, perhaps.
Every instance I've seen, they've disabled the allowance of guest accounts. Okay. It's a separate identity completely. And I think that makes sense for certain environments. But it really depends. It does, as I say, makes things more complex, but it's a boundary that you can put in place if need be. It's something to be thoughtful.
No, makes a lot of sense. And so, by the same token, I've worked with a lot of organisations who are they're good at acquisitions and mergers and divestments, right? So they deliberately keep business units in their own Azure AD and their own portion of their enterprise agreement for purchasing Azure, because it makes it a lot easier. You've got one unit there that you can detach from the mothership and sell to somebody else. And I think that works quite well too. Yep. So then my third pillar is what I always say to organisations is, look, particularly if you're new to this, you don't need a lot of governance, right? The first governance you need is the bit of governance that says, if we want to do something and we don't have any governance, this is how we create the governance before we do what we're going to do. So long as we've got some framework, and I realise that sounds a bit contrived, but so long as we've got a framework to identify that we haven't got any rules, and maybe we should, and let's start with some simple ones and then monitor and iterate through and make them more complicated, then all our bases are covered, because we know where stuff's going to go and where it's going to get paid for, we know who's going to do it, and we know how we're going to control it. Everything else is just plumbing, right?
Yep. I mean, that works quite well because it allows you to scale out quite quickly. Take the larger sized organisations. Yeah, we're going to build out a brand new product. We'll have a new product team. That's a whole new business unit in itself. As long as you've got the governance to know that that's how you want to go, that works really well, I found.
Okay, so we've talked about the car crashes, and I think we've clearly identified that we need governance. But where do we start? And what if I said to you, what kind of governance, what topics might we want to cover, what might we want to control? Where would you start?
So what I want, an organisation, if they're starting on the cloud, to look at controlling is what usage they're going to be looking at. So things like where they're going to be putting their data. Are they an organisation that can turn around and use anywhere in the world because the data that they hold doesn't have any need to be compliant with GDPR or PCI compliance, anything like this, which then makes things nice and open for where they go. But if they've got that problem to begin with, there's no point in them having the opportunity to deploy things into Australia Southeast. One, because it's slow, and two, trying to dev from the UK to Australia Southeast is a painful process.
I'm sure if you're in Australia, it's not slow. But yeah, there we go.
It's slow from the rest of the world to Australia, I should say. Though knowing a couple of Australian MVPs, they're always complaining about the speed of the Australian internet.
Because it's powered by barbecues and shrimps, that's why. But anyway, okay, so there's a bit of governance there. So we need to know where we're putting stuff, because, and this is really where our data sits, right? And this is probably because we've got some grey suit with a clipboard saying, you are NHS England, your data must stay in England, or you are in the European Union, you cannot put that outside of England, outside of the European Union. So that's the where. Okay. So how do you start to apply that then? Because we've got two roles really, haven't we? We've got the people who are creating the stuff we want to run, i.e. the devs, and the people who have to catch that hand grenade when it's finished and run it in production. And yes, I know we're going to talk about DevOps later, but let's assume for the sake of argument that it's an organisation new to the cloud, so they're used to the, hey, look, new version. On a Friday, just before Christmas. Oh, by the way, I'm going on holiday for a fortnight.
So anyway, using that as a good point. So organisations that are getting to that point with the cloud, they've got a lot of background knowledge that they need to know really before they jump in. For those that have gone down the route of just jumping in, yes, if you've got no governance in place, you're probably in a painful place, but you can get out of that painful place into a more happier place, hopefully, with some time and effort. But governance will always require constant review because your organisation changes. I mean, even if we looked at our internal governance here for things that we're doing with the Azure Cloud, it will change in 6 months' time, it'll change again in a year's time, it'll change again in 2 years' time. And that's stuff that we know about right now. For other organisations, that maybe they're building a product that's currently looking at the UK, it might be actually this product ends up being a worldwide product, and that changes their governance again and again. So there's lots of different things that you need to be aware of and continually come back and review. That would probably for me be the key thing, is making sure that organisations go and do reviews. But as part of that, they need to make sure that they keep the people that they've already got here within the organisation actually skilled up for the bits that they want to put out. There's no point you in the dev side of the fence, as it were, throwing me a product that's using Kubernetes when ops don't even know Kubernetes or don't even use it. So they're going to turn around and say, right, we can't support this. We have to get you in the dev team to support this.
Okay, so that's a good secondary of governance then. On top of the where do we put stuff, it's what are we going to use? And so certainly when I'm working with organisations, I think there's two directions to come up that one from. There's a don't use that yet because we don't know it. If we're a .NET shop, why on earth would we decide to write the new product in Go if nobody knows it or uses it? Unless there is some particular strategic aim in mind, at which point our learning and our journey to be experts in that area is part of the project, right?
It's also part of the governance around the project. Because we're not just talking here about governance around the Azure Cloud, but it's everything that you do with the Azure Cloud.
Yeah.
And you need to have project level governance that ties in with your operational level governance, as it were.
Yep.
If the two don't match up, one will bite the other, and it will be the ops team that will bite the projects team.
So I think, again, that's really interesting because you can swing that one in a couple of different ways as well. So there's the, right, we don't want to use any services that are not generally available because there's risk in that they might change before the project is out. We don't know what regions they're going to be available in. That's back to our data again, because services in preview tend to be only in a small number of data centers, right? But I think if you flip that on its head, coming at it from the dev point of view and from the service architecture point of view, we need some principles.
Yeah.
Friends don't let friends do IaaS, right? So we
Sometimes.
might say, if we're doing lift and shift, we might accept some IaaS, but we know that that's a stepping stone, it's not our end goal. We might, and this is where it starts to get interesting, say we prefer serverless over platform as a service over IaaS in terms of architecture. We might actually say, you know what, actually no, we do think that containers is the best direction of travel for us, therefore our service choice is built around containerization and choosing technology that we can deploy in containers and that kind of stuff. And somewhere in between those is, well, how do our principles influence our rules? How do our rules influence our principles? And how do we get to revise them if we suddenly go, oh, heck, you know what, I thought containers were the best thing, but actually they're really not, and functions are better, man.
Yeah, well, that comes down to just how the overall project and the life cycle of the product that's being built. I mean, that's something that from an architectural perspective, you'd have decision points that you'd make early on. You go over the pain points as part of proof of concepts, hopefully, and then realise that maybe you've got too many pain points by going down the route of containerization of a very monolithic application which may never be suitable for containers. It may still actually have to be in IaaS for 1 to 2 to 5 years whilst you do small iterative changes to parts of the application. Mm-hmm. I know we're having that sort of discussion at the moment, whether that might be something that we look at, which I know would be a long, painful process to go down the route of containers, but it might be the right one, it might not be. We won't know until we do proof of concepts.
No.
And from a dev perspective, that's what we need to allow devs to be able to do, but that needs to be in a separate dev test subscription that's slightly less in cost than the production subscriptions.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something we haven't touched on yet, that one of the things I see organisations tripping up with a lot is the first mistake is they don't separate their estate into different subscriptions. A lot of people just go one sub.
I think that comes back from the old methods with Azure Service Manager, where at that point there was a lot of conversation about you just throw everything in and you don't really have any segregation. Then when Resource Manager came around, it was all very much, here, have resource groups, isolate things via resource groups. And as we've seen Azure kind of grow in the last 4 or 5 years with Resource Manager, we actually see that now the way that Microsoft are doing things is they actually do it at a level above subscriptions. They have things called management groups. Let's say this is the application. This is the application team, they have the ops team, they have the dev team, they have permissions that are applied to all the different subscriptions as part of this is an application. And I think that works really well. But you won't know as an organisation, do you have one management group, 2, 10, 20? Do you have tiered levels of management groups until you sit down and kind of understand what it is the organisation wants to do with the cloud?
Yeah, so I think people need to rethink a little bit in that most of us now consider that a resource group is not the level of building block you want to separate application A from application B or dev environment from test environment. The subscription is that base building block. And that means that we can have production subscriptions that are managed by the ops guys where bluntly nobody can actually get in to do much. It's if you want to deploy, you deploy using a service account and it's done by the automation, like always automate.
Yeah.
But then we have separate subscriptions for the development of those applications. And importantly, as you mentioned, production is a production level subscription with an SLA, the money back guarantee, the whole underpinning from Microsoft about the services are going to be running and they'll run around like chickens if they're not, versus dev test up to 20% cheaper. The devs have got more freedom in there because they need to experiment, but we might still have the same set of rules applied to dev test. It's just that they might not block activity. They might just flag a warning light,
Yeah.
so we make sure that things are being developed in compliance with the rules that are on prod, which are hard and fast. Thou shalt
Yes.
not deploy outside my chosen regions, or I'm sorry, Ryan, you cannot have that huge M-class virtual machine. You're desperate to
I
my
need
big
the M128s for everything I do. Absolutely everything. I mean, they only cost, what, a good couple of grand per day? You know?
Yes, that's a whole lot of Bitcoin.
True.
So, back to the plot. We've got a plot, we've got special effects. So we've now established some of the areas of governance we need, what technology we can use, and why we can't use it, and why we need to come back and review, where we put stuff, and we've talked a little bit about cost management, trying to do this thing so we don't get things breaking the bank and breaking the budget.
Yeah, one of the things we haven't covered when it comes to cost management, having good governance in place actually does manage to stop you having all of the problems that come with human error. Just being able to say, right, you cannot deploy into this region, you cannot deploy this resource type, you cannot use virtual machine sizes, even things like making sure that your underlying virtual machine estate, is compliant with the configuration that you expect it to have. But that requires having a lot of background knowledge in the world of automation. If you've not already got that, then you need to get to that point and have that as part of your governance plan of getting to that point to be able to get the full benefit of the cloud. I mean, you mentioned before about production subscriptions being locked down, that's only ever deployable from, something like Azure DevOps and a pipeline that does the deployment. That might be using ARM templates, maybe using Terraform, maybe even using Pulumi, which is a new one of the new kids on the block.
So I've got to say, actually, I watched a session on Pulumi at a recent conference, and I'm really impressed. I love the idea of writing actual code and compiling effectively compiling to a template, running that as a deployment.
It's on my Christmas list to have a look at, because there's been quite a few people shouting about it recently. And it seems interesting, as does Terraform. For the right organisation, Terraform is the right thing. For other organisations that are just Azure only, Azure ARM templates probably always going to be higher up in the chain of things that make most sense.
So the moral really there is actually we don't care what you use, just please use something, don't make it be a human being clicking a button and following a written script, right?
The key thing that, and again this comes back to one of the horror stories, and actually it was when you and me were on site with a client, they asked us to do some additional work to some templates that we deployed to add another virtual machine into their environment. But they've gone around and changed some NSG rules and haven't told us whilst we were updating our templates. So on deployment, we've gone and wiped out all of their new NSG rules because they've gone and done them manually. They've not put them into templated form. Even if they just sent an email saying, here you go, this is the things that have changed since last time you were in, that would have stopped us being able to wipe out their, luckily, pre-production instance. But they knew what they needed to put back in. So it's one of those interesting areas where if you have some automation and some manual tasks, that's where you're going to get the biggest amount of pain points.
Yeah.
And simple things like putting resource group locks or even subscription level locks, stop people getting in, stop people making random changes. The simple thing of saying, hey, you have a delete lock or a read-only lock on a resource group, I then have to take that lock off to make a change, changes the person's mindset about what they're changing and why. They're not just going and making the change because they can. They're now having to think, is this the right change to make?
Okay, so certainly in production we don't do stuff by hand, right? And in development we modify the template first. We only do stuff if we don't know what to put in the template. Then frankly we build a completely different environment, tinker until we've worked that out, then put it in the template and then feed it out through our deployment pipeline into our dev environment, our test environment and so on.
Which works for those organisations that have got that automation skill in-house and they know what they're doing. But for those that are coming into the cloud to begin with, who maybe haven't got that level of automation skills in-house, having some boundaries and having some governance of how do we make changes? Do we put in a bit more of a formal change control process around what we do? Do we just have something like a Teams channel to have a conversation about, I need to make a change to this because of what? and have somebody just say, yes, that's fine, as a second set of eyes.
So long as you capture the action. I think that's the important thing, isn't it? If we make changes, particularly in prod, that are not part of our pipeline, we have to find some way to capture that and replay it elsewhere so that we don't forget next time.
True. This works very well for those organisations that have production and dev environments, but some organisations that we've worked with and I've dealt with in the past, they have one environment. They have their production environment and they've got a lot of manual changes happening in there. So even small amounts of change control process and governance around that massively changes how orgs.
So I've got to say, I have one word of advice to an organisation that has one environment. Just stop, right? Just don't do that anymore. Somehow duplicate that. I don't care how. There's lots of different ways. Make a copy and fiddle with that one first. Please.
I 100% agree with you. I'm just saying that I've seen the horror stories where, somebody makes that change on a Friday at 4 p.m. before everybody's left the office, after, maybe office beers, because that happens regularly in some orgs. And then the on-call guy gets a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning and saying, yeah, the production instance is down, it's been down for the last 7 hours, but our monitoring hasn't told us. These sort of things. It's just, there's a lot of places where you need to get governance right, and some of it is just around how you do internal communications and change control.
So we've talked a lot about now the rules and regs, and we agreed we weren't going to talk about the things in Azure to do the rules and regs, because Jack Tracy did a really excellent session early on in this advent calendar about
the
those.
Beginning of the month, if I remember rightly.
And Wesley Hackman did a good session on Azure Blueprints, which is a way of templatizing and using all of those.
Whilst we've been on the talk about things that are not in general availability, Blueprints are still a preview service.
Yeah, but they're cool. I like them.
They are cool and they are interesting, but they are still preview. But they are definitely something we'd recommend you looking at, because they allow you to build a whole environment from nothing.
But that's all governance about how do we create stuff, how do we get it into prod. We haven't talked at all about what do we need to ensure that we're going to be able to operate this thing properly and see what's going on and deal with things if there is an issue. So what about governance that pertains to operations for management, monitoring and control?
There's a lot there. So one of the key things that you want to make sure is get all your RBAC right. So all your role-based access control. You can use things like Azure Security Center to apply some additional Azure policies. And again, don't really want to talk about the bits of kit within Azure itself, because this talk could even be taken and looked at for AWS. It's all about just getting the right governance in place and having good review process. So things like making sure you've got monitoring of virtual machine configuration. Is it compliant? Is it things like, are you opening up ports to those virtual machines that break and allow a security hole into your organization? We're seeing more and more about breaches all the time, so there's a lot more that organizations need to look at doing. The most simple one is enabling MFA. I mean, I know as a partner, we're pushed nicely.
Oh yes, a nice set of rules that give us no choice. Thou shalt use your phone to log in. Yeah, but that's good, right? It's good practice, and we recommend the same thing to our customers.
Yeah, but there's so much around what you do within the cloud. Just don't throw things in and leave it, because the one thing that you'll find is that you throw in that random M-series VM and 6 months later somebody's coming up to you with, this virtual machine that's just been deployed, why is it's been deployed and sat there doing nothing? What's it for? And you've got no clue. You've named it something weird because you just pushed it, but you need to have some thought process on doing things like resource naming and little things like that.
So that sort of touches on something I wanted to mention, which I see a lot of organisations put a whole load of rules in, and we've got policies and we've got red lights coming on because something's not deployed right, but nobody looks at them. Or we've got logging coming out of the systems that we write, but the developers aren't talking to the operations team about what logging is needed to see what's going on. So we might log if there's an exception, but we don't necessarily log activity. And if we don't actually look at and review our logs periodically, why are we keeping them? Do we need to be able to look back and see who did what? Or actually, would it be better to be alerted that something's gone wrong, or prevent that in the first place? And there's a sort of a spectrum there, isn't there?
Yeah, there's no one single solid good answer to that, because if, say for example, you want to do investigation of a breach, you kind of need to know who did what, when, and with what account. I mean, you might find that they've managed to get hold of a service principal that's got God rights to your tenant, and therefore they've gone on a delete spree. Chaos Monkey is a fun thing to have a look into. Maybe orgs should have a look at doing that within their tenant.
But there's tools in Azure to help, right? So we can start with simple things like Azure Monitor.
Yeah.
Security Center, there are baseline policies that are free. In our application, we can look at App Insights, and we can bring all of that together through log analytics as a pane of glass through which to look. But whilst the technology is really powerful, if we don't get the right information in there to be able to answer the questions we want to pose, it's no use, right? So I always think that there is an area of governance you've got to think about, which is because of the environment we're in, and I mean in terms of regulation and compliance, what questions are we going to be asked from the outside, and how can we demonstrate and provide answers to those questions? Like, if I have a checklist of rules I have to be able to meet and show somebody I meet, policies and blueprints are great for those, right? Because you can define the policies that put the red light on and click them in blueprints.
Define them.
And then I can show them to the man with the clipboard and go, Ryan has done all of this, and he's brilliant. Look, your rule this is monitored by policy this, and you can see that it's green.
Yeah.
And in the event of a breach, what does the regulator need us to provide in terms of information? Does our logging allow us to do that? Can we always prove that our data is where it's supposed to be? And I see a lot of organisations sort of failing to close the loop on that one. I don't know by you on that. I know I do a lot of workshops around that.
Yeah, I've seen a few recently where they know what they think they need, but it's not quite all of what they require. So they're almost there. So yeah, we've been chatting for quite a while now. One thing I think that we didn't really cover is what can devs do to make sure they're not shooting themselves on the foot, particularly with deploying templated environments. I know I've seen it in the past where we're using new and shiny, we're using the latest versions of the API and things like this of say virtual machines that we're deploying. How do we get repeatability when we want to ensure we can deploy this to customer A, customer B, customer C, and it might even be to their own Azure tenants? Are there things that from the dev side of the fence are easier to do that makes that not so much of a pain point?
So we've touched on some of it already, right? Like automate everything. We need some kind of template for what it is we're deploying to the cloud. We need some set of scripts and automation for maybe setting up baseline data, that kind of stuff. But also I think you need to go a bit further than that. Certainly we've had a lot of conversations with customers lately about sort of inner source, if you like. If we've got several dev teams who are working on similar projects, let's build a central repository of base template components to get people started. And those components could be reviewed by the security guys and the ops guys to make sure that we're deploying them correctly. And we can treat those a bit like sort of NuGet packages, right? We can version stamp them, and then when you spin up your project and you want an app service, you can take version 1 point whatever of the app service template. That might then move forward, but I'm not going to break you by forcing that template on you. I spin up a new project, I'm 6 months down the line, I get version 2.0. I'm now ahead of you, you can maybe choose to pull in the practice of that new template, but importantly, just like NuGet packages, you do that as part of a PBI in a sprint or an item on your Kanban board, and somebody's testing it. If we suddenly update our template to use this new component, will it break anything? I think that's important. And I think the second thing is to try to really think about the life cycle of the application and how you're where you want to be over here when you hit production, right when you start in development. And devs are bright guys, right? And yeah, they always want to use the new shiny stuff. But if you put the set of ground rules for that project, and they might be different to other projects, to say, right, okay, Ryan, we're doing a BI project, all right?
Okay.
So I don't mind if data transits through a region because there's a service that needs to process it, but I don't want it to sit there. It's got to stay at rest in our country. Everything's got to be encrypted. We've got to manage all of that. Does that help in your selection of services? That, and don't just rush off and get the latest APIs, the latest SDKs. Sorry. Look at where you're going to be deploying to. Look at what's stable. Look at what's released. Look at what's supported. Build into your development lifecycle the review process for saying, right, now, I don't know, storage SDK X.Y has been out for 3 months and we feel that we're comfortable moving to it because there's been a couple of patches on it and that major release is stable. At the same time, though, you've got to be looking over your shoulder all the time because this is the cloud, right? And the trouble with the cloud is that they turn stuff off. They usually tell you, and they usually give you plenty of warning, but you'd be surprised how often I've seen it that the development team have gone, oh, crikey, we've now got 3 weeks because we hadn't noticed the 18 months, so we've just had an email from the product team going, will you please stop using this?
Yes, I've seen that a few times as well. It's an interesting conversation when that happens.
Yeah, so what that means is that you end up with certain key roles really sort of rising up in the dev team. You need architects that are continually sort of scanning the horizon for the technologies that are coming up, thinking about when they're ready for use, thinking about where they're appropriate for use, and they may or may not be to your organization. And you need people who are similarly looking at the dev tooling and the components and are helping the dev teams manage their movement forward through versions. So you don't get a situation where the latest Visual Studio is released and everybody immediately upgrades and it screws over the CS project file format, the solution format, and then we can't build it.
That's not happened once or twice at all, has it?
No, never to us, ever. Never ever. No. And you need people who are looking at the most appropriate way to manage those deployments, because your deployment pipelines and your infrastructure as code and your deployment scripts, they're all living things as well, right? So in Azure DevOps now, we've got this idea of YAML pipelines. I think they're great because that means our deployment automation is actually living code in our source control system with our code. So if I branch to add a new feature and that new feature adds some new components, then I can put my ARM template in that branch so that I only deploy the new components when I'm deploying that branch. But if I have to do new things on my deployment pipeline, I can put my deployment pipeline in that branch as well. Yeah. And importantly, because I've seen it happen, I haven't broken the production deployment because I've modified the pipeline, but it only works with my branch. And the next time we try and deploy to production, the whole thing catches fire and they come after me with a pitchfork.
But no, it's interesting because I think you've touched on a very good point there, and it's all about having that cycle of review. I mean, keeping everything as possible living within code, even to your infrastructure that you're deploying as part of your application. If that's all in one single repository, that's quite useful.
Yeah.
But being able to pull out, as you say, to set of shared templates, maybe have a controller template that does the deployment. We see this works very well because you can control, am I deploying, particularly now that you can now deploy to management groups, am I deploying to dev and test and production, a whole set new infrastructure for A/B testing in each of those environments, so I can actually do live A/B testing across all the environments much quicker. It makes those review cycles a lot shorter, which should mean that everything works better.
So the most important thing a dev can do in an organization that's new to the cloud? He can take a cupcake and go and give the ops guys a hug and teach them about source control and scripts. Because certainly when I engage with a lot of organizations like that, they've got some really sharp ops guys, but they don't know about those two things. And actually fear can be a big part of this, right? And cloud's new, everybody's worried, they prefer to remove risk in their minds by latching onto the things that are similar to what they knew before. And
The GUIs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The worst thing Microsoft ever did was put a GUI on a server, for God's sake. But anyway, digression. Don't click in the portal, write a script to do it.
Jeffrey Soder said a very, very good point years back. You can't share clicks, but you can share a script.
Yeah.
And it takes a different mindset to looking at deploying something with a script to deploying something via the portal. I mean, from my view of the community, with running and helping run the PowerShell user groups, trying to get people onboarded, the first things that they go is, right, I've started writing this script. I've got version 1, version 2, version 10. It's controlled
I've
mess.
got folders all over my machine.
Yes, things like that. It's an evolution. So over time, I think we'll see more and more of the ops teams getting on board with, whether it's PowerShell for their automation, whether it's Bash, whether it's Ruby, whether it's various other languages that they could use. There'll be more of that coming into the ops world, but it needs to have dev teams being able to say, yeah, we'll spend some time doing lunch and learns, we'll do handover sessions with people, we'll get people up to speed. Because when both the teams work together, the cloud is the easiest place for them to work, because they can actually get the velocity that they require, and also just turn around and say, well, that didn't work, delete it, burn it with fire.
Yeah, I think it's very true to say that if you want to do DevOps, you don't have to be using the cloud. But if you want to succeed in the cloud, you're a lot closer to the metal, so you will get a lot of benefit from doing DevOps, from trying to get that cross-functional team, trying to give the developers more ownership of what's running in production, trying to give the ops and the reliability guys more influence on what's being developed, and say, please don't do it that way because it won't be stable when we run it, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's probably another top tip for organisations new to the cloud. It's all about communication, right?
Yeah.
It really is go and get the devs guys to hook the ops guys and vice versa, because they need to.
Don't put them in two different buildings, put them in the same room and split them, have a dev next to an ops guy and then continue.
Yeah. There's stuff they can learn from each other. They need to be part of, if not one team, then one team of teams, not thought of as them and us.
Yeah.
So people have been watching us yabbering on for a while now. Hopefully we've influenced them in a positive way that they need governance, but it's not to be scary. Where do they go next? How do they start? How can they start chipping away at this mountain?
So Microsoft have released quite a lot of good governance documentation on aka.ms/governance docs, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
But they've also released a lot of good blog posts about how they use things like management groups as well for managing their Azure environment. So I'd definitely recommend looking up that sort of documentation and those blog posts. There's also the cloud adoption framework, stuff around that.
As a formal way of adopting Azure, yeah.
Quite good.
We've mentioned already stuff on the Advent calendar, our colleagues in the Advent calendar, right? I'd also go and have a look at Ignite sessions. Sachivel and Alexander Frankel did some really good sessions on the components for governance at Ignite. There's also some long-haired idiot had a bit of a rant about governance at Ignite that I believe is on there.
Was it you by any chance?
We both got long hair, let's let the audience decide.
True. So there's lots of good sessions around governance at Ignite, but there's also been lots of very good sessions at other conferences as well.
Yep, absolutely. Which is a good thing. Go find your local user group, right?
Yep.
Go get involved in your local community. I mean, we're in Bradford, and there's DevOps and PowerShell and cloud communities in Leeds, in Manchester, Nottingham, not that far away.
Yeah.
You're never too far, even outside the big smoke, from a bunch of like-minded people.
And if you follow Sarah Lean, who works at Microsoft, her handle on Twitter is TechieLash. She's actually got an Azure map of all the different user groups internationally. I don't remember the URL for that one off the top of my head, but there will be another one popping up in Leeds maybe early next year, for all things Azure.
Thanks very much for watching me rant at Ryan. Merry Christmas to all.
And I hope you have a good Christmas and a happy New Year, and hopefully start the year with some governance.
It's so tempting to do something for continuity. Quick, I'll take my shirt off, continuity change.